All right, so we're diving into this research article today, and wow, this one is dense.
It's a big one.
It's called International Perspectives on the Legal Environment for Selection.
22 countries?
22 countries,
Yeah.
yeah. So buckle up, everybody. But I think it's going to be really interesting because, uh, no matter where we work,
Absolutely.
discrimination in hiring is something we all have to be aware of.
He is everywhere.
And it's interesting because, disadvantaged groups are defined differently depending on where you are in the world.
It's wild how much it varies.
It really is. So the article talks about how each country kind of has its own unique history
Yeah.
that shapes who's considered disadvantaged. Like in Australia, they talk about the indigenous aboriginals.
Right.
But then in a lot of European countries, it's more about recent immigrants.
They face the biggest hurdles trying to get into the workforce.
Exactly. And then you've got South Africa.
Or it's the black population that's historically disadvantaged.
Which is interesting because they're the majority there.
Yeah.
So that adds a whole other layer of complexity.
It does.
And even in India, like specific religious castes are considered disadvantaged.
You see that in a lot of places, different groups based on religion or other factors.
It really makes you think about how disadvantage is tied to like the social and political landscape of a country.
Oh, absolutely.
But here's what I thought was really interesting.
Okay.
This research paper says that there's barely any research outside the U.S.
Really?
on how these different groups actually score on like hiring tests and stuff.
That is surprising because I know in the U.S. we have tons of research on that.
Yeah, right. So why do you think that is? Is it just like a cultural thing or is there something else going on?
Well, the article talks about how in the U.S. our legal system puts a lot of emphasis on disparate impact.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
So even if a company doesn't mean to discriminate, if their hiring practices unintentionally end up hurting certain groups,
They can still get in trouble.
exactly, they can still be held liable. And so that means that companies are always trying to prove that their hiring tools are fair.
Which leads to a lot of research.
Tons of research on how different groups perform on these tests, but that kind of scrutiny just doesn't exist in a lot of other countries.
So like even if a hiring test seems totally neutral, if it ends up screening out more people from one group than another, that's a huge red flag here in the U.S.,
Huge red flag.
but not necessarily in other places.
Right, and that's why we see such a difference in the amount of research being done.
Interesting. And that kind of leads into another point, which is that the laws these countries have to combat discrimination are all over the place,
Yeah, some countries have very detailed laws,
like the U.S., Canada, South Africa.
but other places like Chile are just getting started.
It's a huge range.
It is.
And then there's Europe, which is interesting because some European countries don't even collect data on race.
Because of privacy concerns?
Yeah, it's a really strong emphasis on privacy. They believe that not collecting that data is the best way to ensure equality.
Makes it tough for researchers, though.
It's a fascinating paradox, right? They want to fight discrimination, but they're hesitant to collect the very information that might help them understand where the problems are.
Yeah, it makes studying these issues a real challenge, but it's an important consideration.
It is. And, speaking of challenges, the paper also talks about how discrimination is actually proven in court. And that seems to be pretty different around the world, too.
Yeah, it's not always straightforward.
It's not. The U.S. has all these specific rules and statistical tests for proving discrimination.
Things like the 4/5 rule, statistical significance tests.
But most other countries don't. So it seems like it's more about showing that someone was treated unfair specifically because of their group, not just about the numbers.
Right. It's more about the individual's experience and the intent behind the actions. And that also means that our field, IO psychology, isn't as involved in legal cases in those countries.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. In the U.S., we get called in as experts all the time to talk about like test validity and job analysis.
Because of that focus on data?
Exactly. But that's less common elsewhere. So it's a different landscape for us.
Yeah, it seems like proving discrimination in a lot of countries is more of a he said, she said situation.
It can be more subjective, for sure.
Whereas the U.S. really leans on those hard numbers.
We love our data.
We do. But what really surprised me in this article was the fact that preferential treatment for certain groups is actually pretty common in a lot of countries.
Oh, yeah.
Except for the U.S.
That's a big difference.
It is. So things like giving certain groups lower cutoffs on tests or even quotas, especially in government jobs, that seems a way to address historical imbalances.
Right. It's about achieving social equality.
Yeah.
even if it means the playing field isn't perfectly level for everyone.
Which is like the complete opposite of how things work in the U.S.
Right here, it's all about individual merit and equal opportunity. So preferential treatment is seen as discriminatory no matter what the intention is.
And companies are constantly worried about getting sued for reverse discrimination.
Yeah, it's a big concern.
It really highlights how different cultures view the whole concept of fairness.
Absolutely.
What one country sees as a necessary step towards equality, another sees as totally unfair.
And that has a big impact on how companies around the world approach hiring.
Oh yeah, for sure. So the article gives the example of South Africa where, because of their history with apartheid preferential treatment for the black population is not just allowed, it's actually encouraged.
Wow.
They even use quotas to make sure that previously disadvantaged groups are represented in the workplace.
That's a strong stance.
It is, and it's a far cry from what we see in the U.S., where companies are so careful to avoid any appearance of bias in their hiring.
That's a different world.
It really is. But before we go any further, I just want to make sure I'm pronouncing the lead author's name correctly.
Oh, yeah.
It's Herman de Guinness.
Right. Agreements, yeah, like the beer.
Guinness. Okay, got it. So Guinness and his co-authors lay out all these different ways that countries define and address discrimination in hiring.
It's a fascinating overview.
It is. And what I'm finding particularly interesting is how the U.S. seems to be in a league of its own when it comes to the legal framework around all this,
Yeah, we definitely stand out.
especially with that focus on disparate impact and all the research it's generated on group differences and test scores and stuff.
That's a key takeaway.
It is. But it also makes you wonder why this type of research is so scarce in other countries.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Is it purely a legal difference, or are there deeper cultural factors at play?
Maybe a bit of both.
That's something we'll definitely want to explore further. But for now, let's take a quick break.
Sounds good.
And when we come back, we'll dig into some of those possible reasons and how they might be impacting global hiring practices.
I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
It's tricky, right? Like, you don't want to just stir up a bunch of controversy.
Yeah, it's a sensitive topic for sure.
And you can just imagine the headlines. Government study shows this group scores lower on that test. Like, nobody wants to deal with that.
It's a political minefield.
It really is. But I also think the way the laws are structured in different countries plays a big role.
Oh yeah, how so?
Well, like we were saying before, the U.S. legal system is super focused on proving or disproving this disparate impact thing.
Right.
So that creates this huge need for research on group differences. Companies are constantly under pressure to show that their hiring methods aren't accidentally disadvantaging certain groups.
Which drives all that research.
Exactly. But that same pressure just doesn't exist in a lot of other countries.
So it's almost like the U.S. is trying to prevent discrimination before it even happens.
Yeah, kind of like a proactive approach.
While other countries are more reactive, they deal with it after someone's already been harmed.
Right, more of a wait-and-see approach. And that also explains why IO psychology plays such a different role around the world.
That's true.
Like in the U.S., we're super involved in developing these legally defensible selection practices.
We're right there in the thick of it.
But in a lot of other countries, we're more on the sidelines.
More like consultants?
Yeah, giving advice on best practices, but not really shaping the law itself.
Interesting. So two totally different approaches. But, I have to admit, I'm still kind of stuck on this whole idea of preferential treatment for certain groups.
I know, it's a tough one to wrap your head around.
It is. It just seems so counterintuitive to everything we're taught about fairness and equality here in the U.S.
I get it, but remember, in a lot of countries, the goal isn't just to treat everyone equally right now, it's to actually level the playing field to address historical injustices.
So it's more about making up for past discrimination.
Yeah, and creating a more equitable society in the long run.
So equity versus equality.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that the past has real consequences that continue to shape the present.
And the Guinness gives a great example of this in South Africa.
Yeah, what was that?
Because of their history of apartheid preferential treatment for the black population, it's basically built into their legal system. Like they use quotas in hiring and promotions to make sure those previously disadvantaged groups have a real shot.
That's pretty powerful stuff.
It is, and it's something you'd pretty much never see in the U.S.
No way. Companies here are terrified of even appearing to favor one group over another.
That reverse discrimination lawsuit is always looming.
Exactly. It's a huge concern. So companies are constantly walking on eggshells trying to avoid any hint of bias.
Which leads to that heavy reliance on standardized tests and objective criteria.
Yep, trying to make the process as blind as possible to group affiliation.
But isn't there a risk that by focusing so much on being objective, you might actually end up ignoring some of the real inequalities that exist.
That's the big question, isn't it? Like, what if you're accidentally perpetuating those inequalities by trying so hard to be neutral?
It's tricky because what one country sees as fair and unbiased might be seen as totally discriminatory in another.
It all comes down to your definition of fairness, I guess, and how you think equality should be achieved.
It's almost like we're speaking different languages when it comes to this stuff.
In a way, we are, and that makes you wonder how multinational companies even begin to deal with all this.
Yeah, how do they navigate all these different legal and cultural landscapes?
It's a huge challenge. They have to find a way to balance their global policies with the specific laws and cultural norms of each country they're operating in.
Sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It can be, but that's why research like this is so important.
You're right.
It helps us understand that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to fairness in hiring.
It really does. What works in one context might completely backfire in another.
Exactly. So it's crucial to be aware of these differences.
For companies and individuals.
Absolutely. Like if you're job hunting, understanding the legal and cultural context of those hiring practices can really help you navigate the system.
And advocate for yourself if you need to.
Exactly. It's like having a secret decoder ring for the whole hiring process.
I like that. But speaking of decoding, I'm curious about the tools and techniques that IL psychologists use around the world.
Oh, yeah. Good.
Do those vary as much as the legal frameworks we've been talking about?
You bet they do. Like take something as basic as job analysis, for example. In the US, it's like the gold standard.
You mean job analysis?
Yeah, job analysis. It's like the foundation for building a solid legal selection system.
Because you got to make sure what you're testing people on is actually relevant to the job, right?
Exactly. Job analysis helps us break down a job into its core parts, figure out what knowledge, skills, abilities someone needs to succeed.
Makes sense.
But in a lot of other countries, it's not as common.
Really?
Yeah, they might rely more on something called competency modeling.
Competency modeling, what's that?
It's kind of like a broader approach. It looks at the overall qualities and behaviors that make someone a good employee and not just specific tasks.
So more about the big picture, like the whole package the employee brings.
Right, and it reflects a different emphasis. Some cultures prioritize a more holistic view of the candidate, looking at their potential, their fit within the organization.
While others are more focused on like matching skills to tasks.
Exactly, two different philosophies.
So it's like hiring a generalist versus a specialist almost.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Now, what about personality tests? Those seem pretty standard these days. Is that the same globally?
Personality tests are definitely becoming more popular worldwide, but even then you see some interesting variations.
Like what?
Well, the article mentions Switzerland, where comprehensive personality tests are actually banned.
Banned? Why would they do that?
They're really big on privacy in Switzerland. They're worried those tests could reveal too much sensitive information about candidates, stuff that could be misused or lead to discrimination.
It's that balance again,
Even-
right? Gaining insights versus protecting individual rights.
Exactly, a tough line to draw.
For sure.
Yeah.
So where else do they see these variations?
Well, South Africa is another good example. Their legal system puts a lot of pressure on employers to prove that any selection method they use, even personality tests, is scientifically valid and fair.
So, no, just picking a test off the shelf and calling it a day.
Nope. They need to show it's been rigorously tested and that it won't discriminate against certain groups in their specific context.
Which means lots of local validation studies.
Exactly. They want to make sure the tools they're using are a good fit for their unique culture.
Makes sense. So it seems like each country is on its own path when it comes to hiring.
Yeah, trying to find that sweet spot between efficiency, fairness, social justice.
And the role of IO psychology is changing right along with it.
Absolutely. In some places, we're leading the charge, shaping the laws. In other places, we're more behind the scenes, helping companies navigate the complexities.
So what does all this mean for our listeners?
Yeah,
Well, I think the big takeaway is that context matters a lot.
it really does.
Next time you're in a hiring process or you hear about someone's experience, think about the bigger picture. What are the laws and social norms in that specific place? How are those shaping the way things work? Because fairness isn't one size fits all.
It's something we're all working towards, but the path to get there looks different everywhere you go.
It's about being aware of those differences and recognizing that our own definition of fair might not be universal.
Exactly. And as our world becomes more interconnected, that kind of awareness is more important than ever.
Couldn't agree more. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive.
It really has. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. And to our listeners out there, keep those questions coming, and we'll see you next time.